recorded by, or in one instance, written by and recorded by the great alto saxophonist Lee Konitz. How many of you are aware of Konitz, have any sense of him at all? Very important on a lot of different levels. If you look up reference books about Lee, they will always mention the fact that one, his career started in the 1940s, almost in parallel. He's an alto player, almost in parallel to Charlie Parker's. Parker was born in 1920, and Lee was born in 1927. But although Parker was documented first on records in sort of a spare way, first commercially available recordings for Bird was in 1940 as a sideman, a couple of solos with Jamey Aebersold, one small group recording. We're again in the 78 era in 1944. 1945 was the watershed year for Bird. All of a sudden you have all the Gillespie collaborations, and all of a sudden he was out in the open. If you were relying on recordings to get your information about what was the cutting edge in New York at that period of time. Well, Lee, who was from Chicago, arrived as an 18-year-old in New York, right at the point when Bird was he had already recorded, but was really taking wing, so to speak, in terms of developing a huge following in New York City. Lee arrived in New York working with a band called the Claude Thornhill Orchestra that was, if you're not familiar with it, go online and check it out. One of a kind ensemble. It was a dance band, but with like heavenly pretensions. It had, for one thing, Gil Evans and Jerry Mulligan writing arrangements for it. Gil Evans in particular, very, very heavily so. And for what it was, a dance orchestra with more or less conventional instrumentation, it was augmented by, for instance, one or two French horns. There were flute doubles in the band, and they used a tuba melodically, a guy named Bill Barber. And the band on one end of the spectrum played dance repertoire that was so slow, you couldn't dance to it, you couldn't even walk to it unless you were in a funeral procession or something. But on the other end, they played bebop. And Lee Konitz's first two recordings as a soloist, gets a chorus on Yardbird Suite by Charlie Parker and Donald Lee, as arranged by Gil Evans. And right away, you can hear that this guy is not influenced by Charlie Parker in any overt way. There's a moment, I think it's Yardbird Suite, where he actually uses some linguistic gestures on saxophone that I had never heard any wind player use up until that time, which were stacks of consecutive fourths. You know, very unusual. And even though Lee Konitz really, really admired Charlie Parker, idolized him really, and recognized what a force of nature. He chose, and Bert applauded this, by the way, they were friends and knew each other, but he went his own way. He did not. He was almost a man alone in terms of an alto player operating out of New York with a lot of notoriety who did not reflect the influence of Charlie Parker directly. As time went on, it became a little more pronounced, but it was largely absent in the 1940s. And he was a student of this remarkable pianist composer named Lenny Tristano. Not enough, even today, is known about Tristano. He was a Chicagoan, had, as a young person, he, during the flu pandemic of 1918, had lost his eyesight. He was a virtuoso pianist, and eventually pedagogue, at a time when improvisation was something you had to find your own way with. There were a lot of great teachers who teach fundamentals about theory and, of course, instrumental technique. But in terms of somebody finding a way to describe how to improvise in the jazz realm, Tristano was almost a man alone, and would remain so into the 1960s. in a place like New York. And Konitz was his student. And he really went to New York in part because Tristano had relocated there. And as a visually handicapped person, Tristano he maintained a public performance profile, but only modestly so. He didn't feel very comfortable as a visually handicapped person, getting around, needless to say, on his own. He did not have the public profile of somebody like George Shearing, who was also a blind pianist, but was more comfortable teaching. And so he founded a studio, if you will, and generated some great players out of that. Lee Konitz being one, Warren Marsh, a great tenor saxophone player, being another. And he was very much, Tristano was, he was didactic, he was exceedingly sworn to his own perception about what should and shouldn't be, and was so strong a personality. If you went through the disciplines that he had laid out for students, you ended up really having something going on. And Konitz and the tenor, his complimentary tenor saxophone player, Warren Marsh from California, were apparently the two guys who achieved the greatest notoriety coming out of Lenny Tristano's example. So by 1949, the Tristano groups were recording, and really some, if you don't know that music that comes from that period of time, check it out. It really sounds even in advance of bebop, which was the cutting edge at that time. And we can touch later. I mean, when we want to play, we came to play and not talk. But at the end of all of this, I certainly welcome your questions. But Konitz maintained and found a very unique voice that proved to be exceedingly influential. For instance, just to cite one example, Dave Brubeck's alto saxophone player, Paul Desmond, I bet that's the name and a sound that most of you identify with. He cites Lee Konitz as a primary influence sonically. That's where that comes from. And as Lee would tell you himself, he's out of Lester Young. And Lester Young of the 1930s, the great Basie-affiliated tenor player. And Konitz, while finding his own way, very much adhered to the aesthetic values of Lester Young. Melodicism, highlighted, swinging rhythm, a relaxed, light approach to playing. And Konitz, throughout his career, maintained all these things and became a musician, a remarkable collaborator in regard to the different contexts in which you could find his playing. He had a long career. As I said, his professional career started in the 40s. In the 1990s, in his 90s, just a few years ago, he was still performing. He died in the first wave of the pandemic in 2020 at the age of 93. And he was still, like there's on YouTube, there's a video of him at the age of 91 sitting in with the group led by this guy, Rich Perry, the tenor player. And sounding really good. And he practiced all the time. He stayed true to his vision. And I discovered his playing on recordings when I was in college and was really intrigued. You know how things get under your skin. You recognize that he's sort of speaking to the best parts of yourself. And he was certainly doing that for me. Very melodic player. I always liked Lester Young, especially as a player playing in the 30s. And here was somebody who was personalizing that on the alto saxophone. And back in those days, I didn't play tenor. And Konitz seemed to speak to what I was trying to do. And he adhered to the tenets of his teacher, Lenny Tristano, that melody was primary. And I'll say just one more thing before we we start to play, is that Lee was somebody who wanted to go a step beyond the notion of having a recognizable vocabulary that from recording to recording you would hear. In the case of, for instance, Charlie Parker, if you know Charlie Parker's recordings, from recording to recording you hear a lot of the same vocabulary, the same licks, patterns, excitingly performed, just virtuoso material, emotionally relevant, powerful, intense, but the same, there were licks and there were patterns. Like Konitz always said about Charlie Parker that he felt he was more of a composer than an improviser. That he was essentially had this bag of musical gestures that he could arrange and use very creatively. But Konitz wanted to go a step further and have essentially no predictable vocabulary, but be playing from note one, just trying to create new melodies organically on the spot. And it's borne out, if you just listen to recordings of Lee, always melodic, and you never know what he's going to play next. And this is within a rather conservative harmonic vocabulary. It's not like he's playing way out chords, although he was very capable of playing in that context. But rather, and he relied on, and this is what we're going to touch on today, standards, Jerome Kern tunes, Gershwin tunes, Ellington tunes, whatever. He played standards, but when he played these tunes, and some of them he recorded many, many times, they all sound different. And there's a like one of the tunes, actually the last tune we'll play today is a standard called I Remember You. And he recorded it in the section that eventually became the album Motion, his best known album in 1961. And they originally, not too many years ago, they released all the outtakes, including some warm-up takes. There were 8 versions of the tune that were done consecutively, just in the studio while they're getting sound levels, and they would get through an alpha solo, and then they'd stop, and then they'd start. Every solo was completely different. And they were just recorded one after another, in 10 minutes, and they all sound completely satisfying and so forth. So we're going to begin with a standard. Who wrote this tune? Vincent Yeomans, I think.
Yeah, I would say, yeah.
Yeah, this is I Want to Be Happy. And we're sort of following Lee's lead in regard to a trio recording that he did on an album in the LP called Dovetail. I think this is from the 80s. Harold Danko on piano and Jay Leonard. And so we'll give it a whirl here. it's a tune as far as American popular music of the 20th century. It goes way back to the beginning of the century. I think it was written in 1912 or something. And has kind of strange associations in that it's become sort of a heckler's anthem. There was a Judy Garland, one of the versions of the film The Star is Born, the Judy Garland version, has this scene where she is singing My Melancholy, or she's singing some tune and some heckler, sing My Melancholy Baby, sing Melancholy Baby, and it since became sort of an inside joke among musicians, especially jazz musicians, that you'd be playing some repertoire you really wanted, and there'd be some drunk in the audience who would be yelling, play Melancholy Baby. Is it
funny, not funny?
Say what?
Funny, not funny.
Yeah, funny, not funny.
Yeah.
And as it turns out, the Tristanoites, Lee Konitz, Warren Marsh, Tristano, recorded the tune a lot without trying very hard. I found 6 different versions of Lee Konitz playing this tune. So this is our take on My Melancholy Baby. Kim, you want to say something about the next tune?
Not really. I actually don't know much about the history of this tune, except I think the lyrics were written by Harry Tobias,
Yeah.
who has some descendants here in St. Louis.
Is that right?
Yeah, he was a friend of George Gershwin's. They had some gigs in the Catskills, when they were both fledglings. But I don't know much about the tune, except it's a lovely tune, but it takes some weird turns. In terms of keys, you end up in the home key. You're not sure how you got there. And you don't start there. So can be a little tricky. So anyway.
The tune is called Sweet and Lovely, and Konitz recorded at various times. There's 2 duo records. Konitz, for whatever reason, economics, perhaps, he never was much of a band leader. When I say much of one, that is, he didn't have long stretches in a career where he was leading a band in his own image. There were a couple of stretches like that, but by and large, he was a freelancer, and he would end up just traveling the world, just working with rhythm sections and so forth, and recorded a whole lot, but oftentimes accompanied by pianists or small configurations. He even recorded soul. There's an album of him playing standards completely unaccompanied on saxophone. It's quite good, by the way. But 2 recordings come to mind in regard to this tune. One with Al Galper, the great pianist, on a 70s recording on steeplechase called Windows, and then a live recording from the 90s with Alan Broadbent, the Los Angeles based pianist. I can't remember the name of that. It definitely is where Lee had eventually become a living adverb, because it was always something Lee, astonishingly or relaxedly or whatever, But anyway, let's go for this. did I think one of his greatest records was done as a duo with bass player Red Mitchell. And it was called I Concentrate on You, and it was all Cole Porter tunes. And from that recording, we're doing, although differently in terms of the rhythmic context, than on that recording, we're going to do just one of those things. Hold on for a minute. Porter tune. Is it Cole Porter? No, it isn't.
Yeah.
No, it's not.
It's,
It's, who wrote this?
Matt Dennis.
Matt Dennis. Okay. And this comes from, I think, one of the really great periods for Lee Konitz. In the early 90s, he recorded for Blue Note 2 albums, if you're thinking in terms of CDs, one called Alone Together and the other called Another Shade of Blue, which were live recordings that were done with an interesting trio, Konitz on alto saxophone, and Brad Meldau on piano, and Charlie Hayden on bass, doing standards. It's remarkable playing if you've never heard it. It's just like they breathe life into those pieces. And this tune was a highlight off of Another Shade of Blue, and Everything Happens to Me. Mentioned about the influence of Lenny Tristano on Lee Konitz, and the next tune we're going to play was written as an exercise, as an assignment from Lenny Tristano. He said, I saw Konitz interviewed one time, and the way he put it, he said, so Lenny said, why don't you go and write a weird tune? So he did. This is based on a Cole Porter tune called What Is This Thing Called Love? And it was not named by Konitz with this title. It was named by somebody else, but it has lived on, and it's called Subconscious Lee.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
What was the tune you just played?
Oh, Everything Happens to Me. Yeah. tune is one that Lee recorded an awful lot. An old standard, you may know this if you know your big band literature from the 30s and 40s. This tune was Tommy Dorsey's theme song called Getting Sentimental Over You. The standard on the key, although the standard key on the tune, even though Dorsey didn't do it there, is F concert. Lee Konitz always played in the E flat, which is where we're going to do it. And I wrote the outhead that we'll perform is a contrafact of mine based over these chord changes, a new melody. And I wrote it at one point as an exercise, one to sound something like Lee Konitz's work from the 1940s intervallically, and it's an exercise built on the interval of a major 7. So we've got the changes and the melody to Getting Sentimental Over You, and then a contrafact of mine called Linear Lee. questions, or if you wanted to, any rate, we'll be happy to visit some more and so forth. It's been our pleasure to play for you, certainly. And thank you for inviting us. It's been great. This is a tune that comes from Lee's most famous and celebrated recording, something called Motion, that was recorded as a trio in 1961 with Elvin Jones playing drums, Coltrane's great drummer, and a bass player named Sonny Dallas, appropriately titled I Remembered You. Konitz, yes.
Something I've always been curious about, I never bothered to look it up, so I'm gonna rely on your expertise to answer the question. But it seems like the jazz guys at that time were influenced not only by jazz, but also by classical music, and there was a lot going on in the 20th century with, you know, Stravinsky, Schoenberg, John Cage, and even like on the more melodic ethereal side of Ravel and things like that. Especially the West Coast music seemed to have more classical influences, and I don't know if you've heard interviews of these guys talking about that, but surely they.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Specifically, we'll get Kim to talk about this too. But in regard to the East Coast stuff, which is Tristano's school, not a formal school, but his teaching, you had to study, for instance, 18th century counterpoint. And as a matter of fact, it was commonplace. There's actually something on YouTube, an example of this, that before a set, oftentimes Konitz and Marsh would come out, alto and tenor saxophone, and play a Bach two-part invention from memory. And go look on YouTube, and there's an example of that, of them doing that. They also, it was required, if you studied with Tristano, that you studied the Bartok string quartets. That was something that you had to be able to do. And Charlie Parker, for instance, was really interested in classical music of all types, contemporary classical music. Sometimes he would actually quote from it. There's examples of him quoting from Petrushka, the trumpet solo from Petrushka, in improvised solos of his. Supposedly he was really rather obscure composer. So obscure I can't remember the name. That he was a big fan of 20th century composer. And I know that, for instance, the birth of the Cool Band, which was a project that involved Miles Davis and Lee Konitz and Jerry Mulligan and Gil Evans as an arranger. It was an offshoot of an attempt to take the sound of the Claude Thornhill Band and reduce it down to 4 pairs of wind instruments separated by an octave, 3 pair, trumpet and trombone, alto saxophone, baritone saxophone, and trombone, French horn, tuba, and that Mulligan, who contributed the largest number of arrangements to that project, was really, really listening to Stravinsky a lot. They all were. And that was really, really commonplace, as you said, in the 1950s.
Yeah, I don't know if I can add any more to that necessarily, but I mean, if you listen to The Birth of the Cool, I mean, there's a high level of dissonance in that music, and so I can certainly hear Stravinsky's influence amongst those guys. And people like Gil Evans would, they go to the library and check out scores and study orchestral scores, of classical composers. So yeah, they were very much aware of what was.
I remember Jimmy Heath, the great saxophone player who was a contemporary, had actually gone to school with John Coltrane. They were in their 20s, early 20s. They were both in Philadelphia and both aspiring bebop players. But they would go together to the Philadelphia Public Library and get Stravinsky scores, and they would sit there with LPs and headphones and sort of follow along. So, and the West Coast too. I mean, it was very pronounced there, but people like the arranger George Handy on the East Coast was dealing with a lot of that. George Russell was very conversant with that kind of repertoire. And Kim probably knows the story better than I do, but I'm not exactly sure who was responsible for initiating this commission, but the Woody Herman First Heard commissioned something called the Ebony Concerto from Igor Stravinsky that was recorded by the First Heard with Woody Herman playing clarinet. And I think it had something to do with his publisher, Boozy.
Yeah, I think it was, well, that, or I think it was mainly like PR. I think it might have been more the publicist end of things. And Stravinsky, of course there was a lot of PR. Stravinsky was a big fan of the band, and I doubt that was true, but you know, and so, you know, Stravinsky, I guess, listened to the band, listened to recordings and things like that. Hired a saxophonist so he could demonstrate the fingerings to him, apparently. And there's a great, I forget which book it's in. There's a great story about Stravinsky rehearsing the band, and that vodka was very much a presence at that rehearsal. Apparently there was a lot of that being passed around. So the piece itself has like hardly any jazz in it. I mean, I think one reviewer called it dry as toast and not as palatable. Though that piece did grow on me, actually. It is actually, I ended up liking the piece. And there's some sort of jazz isms in it. I mean, like he used some of the characteristic mutes, things like that. Of course, it was for big band, but with the addition of a harp, which is not a standard big band instrument. It certainly wasn't in the Woody Herman herd of that year. I think that was the only one. And maybe I think French horn might have been in it too, but I can't quite remember for sure. So that was an unusual piece. Pretty virtuosic clarinet part.
And also on the East Coast, the rhythm section of Dizzy Gillespie's big band of 1946 was made up of John Lewis on piano, Ray Brown on bass, and Kenny Clark on drums, and Milt Jackson on vibes. And that became the Modern Jazz Quartet, at the leadership of that group was John Lewis, a pianist who was really interested in the conscious fusing of elements of 20th century classical music and jazz, and it became known as the Third Stream Movement. That was based out of the East Coast. It took root in the West Coast when you think about Stan Kenton's recordings in the 1950s based out of California. Most notably, in terms of really getting, quote, out there, Bob Gradinger's composition called Sea of Glass. That, I don't know, I mean, it's sort of a jazz record, but oftentimes not. Not that that makes any difference. But, yeah, that was a great question. And, yeah, these guys were not jazz snobs at all. I mean, they were wide open ears. They were listening to all this stuff.
You mentioned John Lewis. Stephen Jay went to Manhattan School and was dean of the St. Louis Conservatory, president for a couple good long years. And when he tried to take the theory class that John Lewis was teaching in Manhattan, he watched Lewis stopping people at the door to say, have you studied Bach counterpoint? Have you studied Palestrina counterpoint? Do you know how to write in counterpoint? And if not, he wouldn't admit them to the class.
Wow. Yeah. And a place like Juilliard in the 50s, which has really stayed, very much so. They had for a time hired pianist Teddy Wilson, who taught some classes in jazz. I think they were more like sort of jazz preach classes. I don't know how far they got into the technique, but he was there as a visiting faculty member for a time. And who's the guy who arranged all the Thelonious Monk big band music?
Oh, Hal Overton?
Yeah, Hall Overton. Hall Overton was a very fine member, a very fine composer and a member of the composition faculty at Juilliard. But he was a jazz guy. He was a jazz pianist who taught all kinds of jazz musicians. He had a very close relationship with Thelonious Monk. And the two recordings, the one that was done at Town Hall in 1959, and then the one that was done at Philharmonic Hall in New York called Thelonious Monk Big Band in Concert 1964, which is the better of the two recordings, featured Hall Overton's orchestrations and rearrangements of Thelonious Monk tunes, with Monk playing piano. And he was a bona fide classical guy who taught jazz. I remember talking to the longtime bass clarinet player, third clarinet player with the St. Louis Symphony, Jimmy Meyer, who was at Juilliard in the late 50s, and he said he took improv classes at Juilliard with Hall Overton at that time. It was part of the curriculum. It was available. Yeah. Interesting. Yes.
So you guys have been playing together a long time, but when a project like this comes up, like now, like how much, can you tell us a little bit about like how much prep time is involved, or what kind of?
Well, this is the second time we've done this program, truth be told. In November of 21, we did this at school on a Winifred Moore Monday night concert. And then when we talked, and we talked about, well, it would be maybe most appropriate to do a duo concert, it seemed, it's worked well before, so we seemed, why not just revisit this? It wasn't something that probably a lot of people have heard. It's sort of a unique slant on things in regard to some of Konitz's most performed repertoire. So we went that way. But in terms of, we rehearsed, we had three rehearsals for this time. And prior, we had started that summer, and we just got together once a week for, what, 6 weeks or something?
For the original
For
concert.
the original concert, we just
Yeah.
played. We weren't even sure exactly what repertoire we would be doing, but there was a lot of playing and not much talking. And
Yeah.
likewise this time as well.
Yeah. No, I had to shed these tunes on my own, and not quite enough, as it turns out. But you know,
Yes.
Yeah. So, yes.
The weird song that you played, I can't remember the name of it.
Subconsciously.
Subconsciously.
Mm-hmm.
Was there any improvising in that at all?
Oh yeah, the stuff we did up front was all improvised. And it was typical of what Konitz and Marsh and Lenny Tristano would do, where they would, rather than play the melody at the front, they'd play it at the end. So they would just start and they would play, like I played the chorus over the chord changes, chorus over the chord changes, then we did 16 bars, 8 bars, 8 bars, 4 bars, 4 bars, and we played together and hopefully arrived at the same place. And got out together. It was close.
Yeah.
And I guess that's recorded somewhere, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. There's many recordings of Subconsciously done by Tristano. There's in terms of video, there's a great version where Lee Konitz is him teaching in Canada in the 1980s, and he talks about the gestation of that tune, and then he and his pianist Harold Danko perform it. It's a really good performance, and it's done that way where they starts out and they're trading choruses. It's done exactly
I'm sorry, who's
sort of the
performing on the
blueprint
video?
model. I'm
Who's
sorry?
performing on the video?
Lee Konitz and Harold Danko, D-A-N-K-O, and the tune is Subconsciously.
Who wrote the two?
Lee Konitz did. Yeah, it was written as an exercise for Tristano. Tristano told him to write a tune, contrafact.
Isn't Tristano, I don't know him that well, but I know I have an album of his doing solo piano, and it's just like very linear. He's not a real melodic kind of player. I don't know how to describe that album. I don't even remember the name of it.
He's very influenced by Bach, Baroque music, and he wasn't. His playing was really different than, say, someone like Bill Evans.
Yeah.
Not that Tristano didn't understand a lot about harmony, but it is a lot very linear, right? Well, I mean, it's a good observation.
Is all his playing like that, or is that just this album?
Which album? Well, not that I would necessarily know.
Solo, he's playing solo.
It's
Yeah.
probably the real Tristano. That's a famous solo piano recording that he did. It was sort of notorious in that he actually, this was recorded in the 50s, late 50s, but or early 60s, that he actually recorded stuff and then sped some of it up.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
I didn't know.
yeah. And you
That's
can hear
cheap.
it too, because you can hear the fact that at least sonically it doesn't sound normal somehow.
I didn't know he cheated. Yeah.
Well, there was some controversy about it, but he defended it, and I remember
Uh-huh.
Leonard Bernstein was in his camp and said, no, this is, it's just music, I mean,
Yeah.
it's just sound, why not, we can manipulate it. He
Sure.
said we couldn't, you know. There are some people who claim that Tristano's solo piano recordings are the apex of jazz piano. Alan Broadbent thinks that.
Hmm.
I mean, very much so.
Yeah.
And Tristano was also very influenced by Art Tatum on the jazz side of the fence. He was really remarkable, but so, I mean, he was almost like a cult leader. I mean, you had to sort of stay within his teaching, and if you drifted away from it, you were cut off, which is what happened with Konitz, actually. Yeah, they eventually split up because he was taking commercial gigs sometimes, and then he was playing bebop tunes. Pretty interesting. Yes.
Yeah, great effort, Paul and Ken,
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Question, Paul Thornhill. You mentioned Lee Konitz, some of his earliest work was with Paul Thornhill.
First recordings, yeah, of him playing
Was there
solo.
frequent contact between them those two, or was that kind of an infrequent?
No, it was just 1946, 47 was pretty much the duration of those guys working together. If you don't know, Thornhill was a really accomplished pianist, and he ended up doing a lot of commercial work, right?
I honestly don't know
studio
what kind of-
wise and stuff like that.
much about what he did after that band.
Yeah.
so.
Did he leave us fairly soon after that contact with Lee Konitz, or? I don't
No, the
honestly
band
don't remember how long
existed.
he
The
did
band
play.
lasted as long as early '60s.
Did he go?
It was on the road, and but I mean, it was those recordings, the ones from the '40s, are incredible. I mean, just beautiful. They
Yeah, it's
shimmer.
very beautiful.
It's like a 20-year-old kid is playing that well.
Yeah, yeah. He was precocious in that regard, and it was yeah. I mean, they had this guy Bill Barber who played tuba, and yeah, those
Yeah.
Gil Evans arrangements were fantastic.
Yeah.
Those Gil Evans things with Claude Thornhill. Anything else? Thank you so much. Oh yes, one more.
We're talking about those Blue Note recordings, two Blue Note recordings with Brad Meldau on the piano.
Mhm.
Do you know the names of those?
Yeah, Alone Together, because I think Alone Together, I think it's the stronger of the two if you had to pick one or the other. The other one is called Another Shade of Blue. Both from the same evening. They were at a club in Los Angeles, live. And it's a study in contrasts, because Lee is hardly, it's like Zen meditation. I mean, Lee is hardly playing anything, and Brad Meldau was playing like 1,000 notes. And Charlie Hayden, who apparently was not feeling really well, he was having a lot of trouble with his back, is kind of, he's there, and it's solid, but it's
What year was that?
early 90s, I think. I'm probably wrong about that. It's in the 90s sometime. Those are great records. They really open your eyes and ears, just because the concept is so non-virtuosic in the traditional sense, excepting what Brad Meldau does. Because Lee sounds just like an abstraction of saxophone. They're beautiful stuff.
Is Meldau moving away from the melody and you can't recognize the
Oh
sound?
yeah, yeah. I mean, there's some wonderful contrapuntal stuff on that recording. It's really nice.
We just got tickets to hear him play at the Sheldon in November.
Oh, wow. With the trio. Yeah. He's fantastic. Yeah. Okay, yes.
Who else have you thought about looking into for these conversation type events? Anybody else? Because
Oh, you mean?
this does good service to a composer that not a lot of people know,
Uh-huh.
a player that not a lot of people know.
Yeah. In the time, I just retired from Webster University, so I'm not part of the concert series. I was shaping the concert series for years and years there, and we did, virtually every faculty concert was a focus on a different composer or the legacy of a jazz record label, like Verve in the 1960s, or Riverside in the 1950s, or Blue Note in the 50s and 60s, and so forth. And like I said, we originally presented this program as part of that. Whether we'll, I mean, Kim and I like to play, but we do not just as a duo concert, but in all other kinds of contexts as well. And I'm sure we'll be doing some work in the future of some other composer or figure who maybe doesn't get heard enough. But we've done a lot in the past, but right now no plans in the immediate future. Yeah.
Question, Paul. Where can we hear you guys this summer? Either of you been performing during the summer?
For me, this is it.
This is it for you? Okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this stuff is all in the past. What's coming up, though, is that Dave Black, a local guitar player, and I recorded a duo album pre-COVID, but it's going to be released. Dave keeps telling me, we're almost there. Yeah, this was recorded quite a while ago, but I've seen like the art and all that stuff, and he said it's going to come out. Hopefully, God, I hope it comes out in the next month, and there'll be a performance relative to the release of that CD, and it's Dave's project really. It was on his dime, but I think it turned out pretty well. So, I can't think of, beyond that, I can't think of anything right now that I'm going to be doing. There's been some, like I recently did a thing with guitarist Dan Rubright and Steve Davis playing drums and Ben Wheeler playing bass, playing dance music. It was really, really fun what we did, and I don't know, some other gigs. We played really a celebration of the legacy of Dennis Owsley, the great jazz historian and radio broadcaster. Last week, it was a week ago today, we did that at KWMU. It was sort of an open jam session that Kim and I were both really involved in. And
it was videoed or was it live?
it was live. Yeah, it was live. It was, it was the family is the one who initiated this, the Owsley family, and they got it was done with the cooperation of KWMU, and they asked me to try to put some music together. So I just called up all kinds of people, and we provided instruments, and so it was sort of a jam session. But, you were there.
Yeah. Wonderful, wonderful effort. Can we see you? Will we see you this fall at Webster on Monday night?
In the library,
No.
checking things out. No one's asked me yet, and they know probably
Should we
a
make
good
some
idea.
phone
They
calls to
seem
get
plenty.
that done?
Yeah, no, I'm not going to be playing on the concert series, but that. should
Yeah, I don't
be-
know what the concert series is yet. I don't think we know what's happening on
Well, the
concert
dates
series.
were picked out,
Right.
and
right.
then I met the new director of jazz studies. Bennett Wood, who's the former head of educational outreach for jazz. He'll be the new director of jazz studies. He and I met a couple of weeks ago and talked about the concert series, because all the dates were secured last spring. So they're there,
Mhm.
but he's got to work it out in terms of
Sure.
what it's going to be. Thanks for going the distance.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.